Welcome back to my series on chess opening theory. In this video, I will be taking a look at the bishop d3 sideline in the Winawer variation of the French defense. So the French defense is when we have the moves e4, e6, d4, d5. And the Winawer is when white now plays knight to c3 and black plays bishop to b4. So, normally in this position, white will now play the move pawn to e5. That is what will happen in most games. However, there are a number of sidelines to worry about. Like, if white does not play pawn to e5, then white does have to do something about the fact that black is threatening to win this pawn, as the knight is pinned to the king. So, one approach that white can take is to play the move bishop to d3. This is not actually a great sideline for white, but it's still worth knowing about, as it can lead to some interesting positions. So here in this position, the best move for black is to now just take the pawn. White takes back with the bishop, and black can now just play knight to f6. Attacking the bishop, it is currently not actually defended by this knight due to the pin. And in this position, there are a number of moves that white can now play. For example, white could play bishop to g5 to pin the knight to the queen so that black cannot take the bishop on e4. And here there are actually two pretty good moves that black can play. Like in Anish Giri's course on the French, he prefers the move knight bd7. I personally like the move pawn to c5, just striking at the center, putting pressure on d4. And in this position, there are again a few moves that white could now play. For example, white could take the pawn, black would then take the queen, white would take back with the rook. Taking with the king is silly because you kind of be giving up the rights to the castle for no good reason, while if you take with the rook, you get the rook into the game. And in this position, black does have to be careful, of course, of the possibility of the rook landing on d8 and giving mate if this knight should move. So that is why black cannot take the bishop over here, because that would hang mate in 1. So anyway, black could then play bishop takes c3 check, pawn takes, and then knight bd7, now threatening to take the bishop because this knight blocks the rook, and also threatening this pawn, like basically just go take back the pawn that was captured. And basically, this is still a fairly interesting position. Best move for white, according to the engine, is just to take, and then take back. Bishop to f3, pawn to e5, and then maybe something like pawn to c6, pawn to e4. And, this would be kind of interesting. Another thing that could happen after bishop g5, pawn to c5, is white could just develop their knight to defend this pawn. White might not want to put the knight on f3 just because the bishop might want to go back there. And then take. Again, bishop takes. This time take with the queen. Queen takes d4. And here, when... let's see. Oh, no, never mind. I was thinking of a different line. But anyway, just take here. Take here, take here, take here, and then in this position, black would just have an interesting endgame. Like, black has to be mindful of this pawn on b7 being a bit vulnerable to being attacked. But in this position, I prefer black, even though it's about objectively equal, as black has better pawn structure, though white does have the short-term advantage of the more active pieces. So that's another thing that could happen if white went for bishop g5 and then black played c5. And there's some other stuff as well. If you want, you can just check out my study. I do cover some other variations. But I think I should now just turn my focus to the main move, which is back in this position when black attacks the bishop. The main move, of course, is the most intuitive one. It's just to play bishop to f3. Here, there are a number of good ways that black can now play, but I personally just like castling kingside. It's also the move that Anish Giri recommends in his course. And let's see. Yeah, 1 second. And in this position, by far the most popular move for white is just to play knight to e2, just defending the knight and potentially avoiding the doubled pawns, also getting ready to castle kingside. And here, in this position, what's actually pretty cool is that Anish Giri, in his course, he recommends this very cool pawn sacrifice, which I think at the time was a novelty. Like, it was a move that had never been played before. And it's a very cool idea in this sideline, but one of the problems with novelties is that very often, like, what makes them novelties is the fact that they've never been played before. So if you actually want to study how does this cool new idea work, well, you normally have to try it out yourself, or you have to wait until somebody else tries it out, which is the case in this game. So what the novelty is, which is what happened in the game, is this pawn sacrifice with pawn to e5, and I really like this move since it strikes at the center. Black's king is castled, whereas white's king is not yet castled. So, in principle, just trying to blast open the center makes a lot of sense in this situation. That generally is what you want to do when your opponent's king is not castled. And not only that, but it also helps solve one of the big problems in the French, which is the French bishop. The bishop is now not blocked by the e-pawn. Like, we do still have to be a bit careful about this bishop, of course, applying pressure on the b7 pawn, but it is nice to just get this out of the way right now. And so in this position, white kind of has to take the pawn. Like, taking the pawn is the best move. If white just castles, then black can just take this knight, and then after knight takes, white can take this pawn, and then play c5. The position is still about equal, but it's dynamically equal. Black is up a pawn, but white does have, some piece activity going for them. White will probably regain the pawn eventually, but, black is kind of equalized out of the opening, and that's good stuff. That's what you want to do. And equalized in the interesting sense, in the dynamic sense, not in the, oh no, this is going to be some boring draw due to a move repetition or whatever. Anyway, so that's what would happen if, if white castled instead of taking the pawn. Taking with the b pawn isn't really so great, because that would actually just lose this bishop, as bishop has nowhere to go. E-pawn just comes forward and eats the bishop. Yum, yum, yum. And so if instead of taking the pawn, if white tries a different move, such as bishop to g5, then still just take this pawn, and after queen takes, it's like basically knight takes will just be met with this annoying check. White would have to, do something, kind of make their position a bit worse, like maybe bring their bishop back, or maybe just put the knight back in order to deal with this check. So queen takes d4 is slightly better, but it does lead to a similar idea. After queen takes, knight takes, still do this check, and we would have an interesting game. The position is still about equal. Like, white has to do something about the check, but white does have, some nice active pieces. Like, all these guys are doing pretty well. But anyway, back in this position, most likely thing that will happen is for white to take the pawn, which is what happened in the game. And before continuing, I thought that I should just now introduce the players. So, with the white pieces, we have Grandmaster Vugar Asadli, who is a young grandmaster from Azerbaijan. In fact, he became a grandmaster in 2019, so about a bit over 3 years ago, something like that. And I think he did quite well in the World Youth. Let's just dig that up really quick. 1 sec. Yes, in the 2016 World Youth Chess Olympiad, had also scored quite well in the Portugal Open Rapid. And, well, he's still a fairly young player, so hopefully we get some cool things from him in the future. And with the black pieces, we have Grandmaster Ricard Rapport, who is a Grandmaster from Hungary. and Romania. Like, he used to play for Hungary. He won the Hungarian chess championship multiple times and is also the youngest or holds the record for youngest Hungarian to ever become grandmaster. Like, he became a grandmaster at the age 13, which is very impressive. But perhaps what is more fun is just his playing style. Like Grandmaster Rapport, he's got just a very cool opening repertoire featuring lots of weird and interesting novelties and ideas. And he's just one of the more fun Super Grandmasters to watch because he's not always playing the same openings. He's very often mixing things up and getting really weird and interesting positions that are, very much worth studying and just brings so much spectacle to the events that he plays at. And recently, I think he changed federations. He used to play for Hungary, and now he plays for Romania. And this particular event took place, this particular game took place at the Gashimov Memorial Rapid Tournament in 2021. And if I remember correctly, Grandmaster Rapport actually won this event. I think he tied for first with Karyakin or something like that. And anyway, more information about the players and the event can be found in the video description. And now back to the game. So Black has sacrificed their pawn on e5, but Black will be getting plenty of compensation and just a really fun position to play. After Black now plays Queen takes d1 check, White has to take with the king as the knight is still pinned. So King takes, and here comes Knight g4, already threatening to win back the pawn by forking the pawn on f2 and the pawn on e5. So White gives up the bishop pair, bishop takes g4, bishop takes g4. Black is now threatening to mess up White's pawn structure since this knight over here is pinned to the king. So bishop takes knight is a threat. White plays f3. Somewhere in the distance, Ben Feingold is screaming at White for having done that. Anyway, we have bishop to f5, pawn to a3, bishop takes c3, knight takes c3, knight to c6, just trying to win back the pawn, also developing a piece. White plays rook to e1, and what's pretty funny is that, according to the engine, White should just give back the pawn. Even though that's kind of unintuitive, like the engine wants White to just play the move bishop to e3. Should probably just check this line really quick. Like, one of the best moves for Black is to just take the pawn, and then White could then play like king c1, apparently, according to the engine. Yeah, this is kind of weird. This is kind of unintuitive. And we're like 14 moves into the position, so I won't worry too much about theory as to why bishop e3 is best. Black is still doing very well if White somehow knows about that move. Anyway, White now played rook e1, which is much more human, much more intuitive, just trying to hold on to the extra pawn. Like, basically, Black has sacrificed a pawn for the sake of piece activity, and so if White loses that pawn, then White's just going to have a worse position. Like, Black will just have much better pieces than White does on the board, so it doesn't make much sense to just, let Black take the pawn. Anyway, we have rook a d8 check. We have bishop to d2, rook f e8, developing the final piece, and again, putting pressure on this guy over here. And in this position, White started going a little bit wrong, although it's actually very tricky to see this idea, like see what the engine wants White to do here. White's played a very human move, which is king to c1, just getting out of this annoying pin, freeing up the bishop perhaps to move. But what the engine wants White to do is to play b3, and the reason why is so that when Black plays knight to d4, White can play rook to a2 and defend this pawn this way. And, that's kind of a weird idea. That's not something you typically think about. Like, it's like, well, where is this rook going to go? Is the idea to eventually maybe push this pawn and get the rook, to over here or something? That's not something you're normally going to think about. out and stuff. But still, I thought I should mention this, as this is a pretty funny, pretty weird idea. Instead, white played king to c1. One thing you might notice in this position is that even though white is up a pawn, white actually has a very serious problem in the form of this rook. Like, how is this rook going to get into the game? Nobody knows. Oops. Although apparently the engine knows. Apparently it's rook a2, all that kind of stuff. But anyway, okay, in this position, black now played the move knight to d4, going after the pawn on c2. White played knight e4, blocking the threat. However, knight e4 has another problem, which is just that it drops the pawn on e5. So now white played bishop to c3. The engine prefers bishop to f4. Not going to worry too much about the reason why. It's a bit unintuitive. But basically, and even with bishop f4, we can kind of see that the engine is kind of evaluating the position as black being up a pawn, and that's mainly because black's pieces are very active. They're all in the center, they're all participating, they're all doing stuff, whereas white's pieces are a bit silly. This rook in particular is just a very unhappy rook. He's not able to do much. Anyway, white played bishop to c3, and now a cool little idea from black. Black played bishop takes e4, and white actually has to take back with the pawn. If you want, you can pause the video and try to figure out why taking with the rook is a bad idea. So I will reveal the reason in 3, 2, 1. So basically, the reason why taking with the rook is bad is because it loses material. Basically, black can now just play rook takes e4, and after pawn takes, knight comes here with check. The king has to go to b1, only move. Rook d1 with check, only one legal move for white. King to a2. Now there's knight to c1 with check, and white is forced to give up the exchange here. White is forced to play rook takes c1, rook takes. The reason why, like basically if white just tries repeating moves or something, is black can give this discovered check, king goes back, and then knight takes, and black will just be up a rook. Okay, so that is the reason why back in this position, rook takes e4 is not really possible for white to play. That is the reason why white has to play pawn takes e4. And this is very unpleasant for white because this is an isolated pawn, and isolated pawns are only really good when you're attacking. Like, they're good attacking resources, but white's pieces are not really in a good position to be attacking stuff. Like, what is this rook even doing, you know? Like, it's kind of black who's the one who's attacking, so this pawn is nothing more than a weakness for black to go after. And in fact, that is what black now does. Black plays pawn to f5, not only going after this pawn, but also making some luft for the king if black should ever need it. Now, that's one thing to always keep in mind in these kind of endgames with rook on the board, is to make sure that there are no back rank mates. Like, it can be a bit scary to push this pawn because it does open up this diagonal, but one thing to notice is that there are no pieces that play on the light square diagonals. So, there is no downside there, and black is just going to win this pawn. There is no way for white to really save this pawn, as it is pinned. Like, if white takes, then black will just take this guy over here. So white plays pawn to b4, maybe getting ready to fianchetto their king, stuff like that. Black plays rook takes e4, white takes with their rook, and we have this trade. We have king to b2, and here black does go a little bit wrong with the move knight to b5. Like, basically the knight kind of went in the wrong direction. Although from a practical standpoint, I think even with the move that black played, from a practical standpoint, even though the engine only gives black, kind of a slight advantage here, from a practical standpoint, I think even with Grandmasters playing, as we do have in this game, that black will win. The correct move, according to the engine, is knight to f4, knight to f5. Trying to remember the reason. I think there were probably some ideas of just going in this way, that kind of stuff. Whereas on b5, the knight does seem a little silly. After rook e1, just move the rook over here like this, for example. White has to do something about this pawn potentially coming down. King c1, king can go back to c1 because rook is now in the game. Black would play something like king f7, and then we would just kind of have a bit of a different game here. But I do kind of agree with the engine that the knight is better placed on the king side near this pawn, as this pawn is one of black's best assets, whereas on b5, it's like a bit far away from the pawn. It's kind of tricky for it to participate. Like, I suppose it could come back to d6 to defend the pawn, but I think black should be aggressive and push for the win. Anyway, that's not what happened in the game. Instead, we have knight to b5, hitting the bishop, opening up this file for the rook, that kind of stuff. We have bishop to e5, trying to counterattack, putting some pressure on this pawn. We have rook to e8, bishop goes back to g3, good square where it helps defend the promotion square. This is also probably one of the good things about knight to f5, is that it would actually cover this square. Or the knight might actually be happy to trade for this bishop and kind of mess up white's pawn structure a little. Black's king might be able to arrive in time to support this pawn, and even if white is able to win it, white would only be able to do so by trading their rooks, and black might be able to win the endgame if there are doubled pawns there, since that is a potential weakness in a king and pawn endgame. Anyway, we have king to f7, pawn to c4, knight to d6. We have pawn to c5. White is trying to do something, maybe advance with these guys, maybe somehow win this guy over here, as we now see. Bishop takes c7, pawn to e3, king to c3, pawn to e2. This pawn is getting very dangerously close to promotion. King to d2. We have knight to e3. White cannot yet take the pawn because of discoveries on this bishop, for example, and also on the rook. And in this position, white needed to play the move rook to e1. And rook to e1, if I recall correctly, still has some fair drawing chances for white. Like white might be able to draw this, although if black plays very accurately, the two humans are playing, black probably would still win. But anyway, the part of the reason why rook to e1 is better than bishop to g3 is because white would be threatening and probably succeeding in just winning this pawn, just taking the pawn away. We might have a continuation like knight to c4 check, king d3, knight takes a3, and then maybe just take the pawn right now, stuff like that. But this is not what happened in the game. Instead, what happened was, back in this position, instead of playing rook to e1 and going after this very dangerous pawn, white played the move bishop to g3. The players were probably short on time, especially since this was a rapid event. Black now played knight takes g2. We have bishop to e1, just getting in the way of the pawn. And in this position, what's actually pretty interesting is the engine does give black's next move as a blunder, but I kind of disagree a bit with it. I don't really see why this, makes much difference. I think the engine might have just got confused. But anyway, black played knight to e3. The sequence that the engine does propose is a lot more forcing, and I do prefer it, even though I don't fully understand why the engine hates black's move. Just play rook d8 check, and then basically force the king to take this pawn because moving away is no good. And then the idea is to essentially do what happened in the game, which is play rook e8 check, king f1, and then just trade everything over here with a winning king and pawn endgame. But that's not quite what happened in the game. It's pretty close. We just have knight e3, bishop to g3, Knight goes back to g2, bishop to e1, and now black's like, okay, I'm going to do everything that was just said. So rook d8 check, king takes, rook e8 check, king here, knight takes, rook takes, rook takes, king takes. We have king e6, king e2, king d5, king d3, pawn to a6. Engine says h3 is inaccurate, but no, it's not. There's no difference between -4 and -6 in this scenario. It's just losing and losing. Like, all that black cares about is whether they can promote a pawn to a queen. So we have pawn to g5, king to e3, pawn to h5. Black is advancing these pawns. Pawns making, potential nasty, possible pass pawn over here. White plays king to f3, and then just immediately resigned because white probably just saw that the king and pawn endgame is actually just completely lost. So technically the game ended here, but I thought that I should still show how the game could have continued, like why this is a losing position, why white resigned here, because at lower levels, you generally should not resign. Like, you should never resign, except maybe when your opponent is up a queen, for example. I guess there you could resign, but like, if you're a beginner, you should not resign if your opponent's up a queen. But anyway, the game could have continued. King to e4. The idea is that basically white cannot actually win both of these pawns without losing this pawn. Like, there's just no way for that to be possible, but at the same time, white's king has to be distracted by these two guys, because otherwise these guys will just run up the board and promote. So while white's king is distracted, black's king is going to run in and win these pawns on the queen side, and then make a queen with one of these two friends over here. So after a move like king e4, trying to go around to win the pawns, black would just play king b3. White can't really go running this way because black would just push this pawn down like that. So king f5. Now black should play pawn to g4, because otherwise white would just take this guy and not take this guy. Like, basically, black's pawns should kind of take this pawn down with them when they go. So white would have to take, because otherwise the pawn would just keep running, or would take this guy and run that way. Okay, so takes. White has to take, because otherwise the pawn runs down. King would not be able to catch it. King takes a3, and then threatening to win this pawn. Messing up the pawn structure does nothing. Black will just run this pawn up the board. And white's king is not even in time to win the pawn on b7, because, for example, if you just count the tempo, when the king gets here, black will just promote, so we don't even have to worry about possibilities of queen versus bishop pawn on the 7th rank, which is an important endgame to know about, since that can be a draw depending on the positioning of the attacking side's king. But in this case, no, we don't have to worry about that. The queen arrives in time to save this pawn, and this pawn over here on the white side of the board is nowhere near the 7th rank. But anyway, this is not what happened in the game. The game ended here. White just kind of saw all this and resigned. And yeah, that'll be everything for this video. I hope that you enjoyed. I'm going to try to put out at least one video every 2 days or something like that. And bye for now. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe.